"Run now," shouted the Apache Warchief to the woman tied to the stake. Flames already licking at her feet, her crime nothing more than saving 2 native children from drowning. Arizona Territory, late summer 1876. The desert air shimmered with heat and hatred, and the mob's torches burned almost as hot as their fury. Lillian Pritchard had always known the frontier was unforgiving, but she never imagined it would demand her life as payment for mercy. The ropes bit deep into her wrists, already raw and bleeding from her struggle. Smoke rose in thick columns around her, stinging her eyes, filling her lungs with the acrid taste of mesquite and rage. The crowd gathered in a semicircle before her, their faces twisted with righteousness, convinced they were doing God's work by burning a woman alive. She could see their children watching from behind their mother's skirts, wide-eyed and curious, learning that cruelty could wear the mask of justice if you told yourself the right story. 2 days earlier, none of this seemed possible. Lillian had been living quietly on the edge of Whiskey Creek, a settlement so small it barely warranted a name on any map. Her husband, Thomas Pritchard, had died 3 years prior from fever, leaving her with nothing but a small adobe house, a vegetable garden that refused to thrive in the hard-packed soil, and a reputation as the widow woman who kept to herself. She rarely spoke to the other settlers, not because she was unfriendly, but because she had learned that words in this territory had weight, and the wrong ones could get you killed. The frontier had no patience for nuance, no room for the kind of person who saw humanity in faces the town had decided were less than human. She had gone to the creek that morning to fetch water, carrying 2 wooden buckets on a yoke across her shoulders. The sun had barely crested the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber, and the air still held a whisper of coolness before the desert heat would make everything shimmer and waver like a mirage. Whiskey Creek itself was nothing impressive, more of a shallow stream that wound through red rock canyons and scrub brush, but it was the only reliable water source for miles. Lillian had made this walk hundreds of times, knew every stone and shadow along the path, could navigate it with her eyes closed if she had to. That morning, though, something was different. She heard it before she saw it. The sound of splashing, frantic and urgent, followed by a child's cry that cut through the morning stillness like a knife. Lillian dropped the yoke and ran toward the sound, her boots kicking up red dust, her heart already hammering in her chest. When she reached the bend in the creek, where the water pooled deeper, carving out a small basin beneath an overhang of cottonwood trees, she saw them. 2 children, native children, no older than 6 or 7 years old, thrashing in the water. One was already going under, small arms flailing, mouth open in a silent scream. The other was trying desperately to reach him, but the current, weak as it was enough to pull them both toward the deeper end, where the rocks were slick and treacherous. Lillian did not think. She did not pause to consider what it meant, what it would look like, what the consequences might be. She kicked off her boots and waded in, the cold water shocking against her skin, even in the summer heat. The bottom was uneven, studded with stones that bit into her feet, but she pushed forward, reached the first child just as his head went under again. She grabbed him by the shirt, hauled him up, felt his small body coughing and sputtering against her. The second child was closer now, eyes wide with terror, and she snagged him too, pulling both of them toward the shallow edge where the water barely reached her knees. She dragged them onto the bank, checked them over quickly. They were soaked, shivering despite the heat but breathing. The smaller one coughed up water, his chest heaving, and the older one clung to his brother with a grip that would not loosen. They stared at her with dark eyes that held fear and confusion in equal measure, and she realized they did not speak English. She did not speak Apache. But fear and relief need no translation. She smiled at them, tried to make her voice gentle. "You're safe now. You're all right." They did not understand the words, but they understood the tone, and slowly, hesitantly, the older boy nodded. That was when she heard the horses. The sound of hooves pounding hard-packed earth, the jangle of bridles and spurs, and then the voices. Angry voices. Men's voices. Lillian turned and saw them coming down the trail. 5 riders, all of them from Whiskey Creek, all of them men she recognized. At the front was Silas Garrett, the town's self-appointed enforcer, a man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that held no kindness. Behind him rode his brother Emmett and 3 other men whose names she knew but whose faces blurred together in her memory because they were all cut from the same cloth. Hard men, men who believed the only good Indian was a dead one, and anyone who thought otherwise was a traitor to their own kind. Silas pulled his horse to a stop, dust swirling around him, and his eyes moved from Lillian to the 2 boys and back again. His expression darkened. "Step away from them, Lillian." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, the tone of a man giving an order he expected to be obeyed without question. Lillian straightened, placing herself between the children and the riders. "They were drowning. I pulled them out." Silas dismounted slowly, deliberately, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "You pulled out 2 Apache brats who probably would have done the world a favor by drowning. Now step aside." She did not move, could not move. Something in her refused to budge, refused to let these men take these children and do whatever it was they intended to do. "They're just children, Silas. They weren't doing anything wrong." Emmett spat into the dirt, his face twisted with contempt. "They're savages, Lillian. Their people have been raiding our cattle, burning our farms, killing our kin. You think saving 2 of them makes you a saint? It makes you a fool." The other men had dismounted now, forming a loose circle around her. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the cold certainty that they were right and she was wrong, and nothing she said would change that. Silas took a step closer, his voice dropping to something almost conversational, which made it all the more menacing. "You know what folks are going to think when they hear about this? They're going to think you're an Indian lover. They're going to think you've gone soft, maybe even turned traitor. And in a place like this, that kind of thinking gets people hurt." Lillian met his gaze without flinching. "I don't care what people think. I care that 2 children almost died, and I was there to help. That's all this is." Silas laughed, a sound without humor. "That's all this is? Woman, you just crossed a line you can't uncross. You just made yourself an enemy of every person in Whiskey Creek who's lost someone to the Apache. And that's most of us." Before she could respond, one of the other men, a wiry fellow named Jed Morrow, lunged forward and grabbed the older boy by the arm. The child cried out, struggled, but Jed's grip was iron. "Let's take them back to town. Let the council decide what to do with them." Lillian stepped forward, her voice rising. "No, you're not taking them anywhere." Silas moved faster than she expected, his hand closing around her wrist, yanking her back. "You don't get a say in this, Lillian. You already did enough damage." She tried to pull free, but his grip tightened, bruising. The 2 boys were being hauled toward the horses now, their small voices crying out in a language she did not understand, but whose meaning was clear: terror, desperation, betrayal. And then, from the ridge above, came a sound that froze everyone in place. A war cry, sharp and piercing, echoing off the canyon walls. The riders spun, hands going to their weapons, and Lillian looked up to see him, a lone figure on horseback, silhouetted against the morning sun. Even from a distance, she could see the power in the way he sat, the absolute confidence, the kind of presence that made grown men hesitate. He descended the ridge slowly, deliberately, his horse picking its way down the rocky slope with the ease of long practice. As he drew closer, Lillian could make out more details. He was Apache, that much was clear. His face was angular, hard-planed, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. He wore no headdress, just a red band tied around his forehead to keep his long black hair out of his face. His chest was bare except for a beaded necklace, and he carried a rifle across his lap with the casual ease of someone who knew how to use it. Silas stepped forward, his hand still on his pistol. "This is white man's business, Apache. Turn around and ride back to wherever you came from." The Warchief's gaze swept over the scene, taking in the 2 boys, the men holding them, and Lillian standing between them all. When he spoke, his English was clear, precise, laced with an accent, but perfectly understandable. "Those boys belong to my tribe. You will release them, Emmett laughed, a harsh bark of sound. Or what? You going to take on all 5 of us? The Warchief's expression did not change. If I must. There was no bravado in his voice, no posturing, just a simple statement of fact. Lillian could see the other men shifting nervously now, their earlier confidence wavering. This was not some random Apache warrior. This was someone who commanded respect, someone whose reputation preceded him. Silas hesitated, his eyes narrowing. You got a name, Indian? The Warchief inclined his head slightly. Timer, Warchief of the Chiricahua, and you are trespassing on land that was ours long before your people arrived. Silas snorted. That land belongs to whoever can hold it, and right now, that's us. Timer's gaze shifted to Lillian, and for a moment their eyes met. There was something in his expression, a flicker of recognition, not of her specifically, but of what she had done, of the choice she had made. The woman saved my people's children, he said quietly. That is a debt I will not forget. Silas turned to Lillian, his face darkening with rage. You see what you've done? You've made yourself a friend of the enemy. You've chosen a side, Lillian, and it's the wrong one. Before anyone could move, Timer raised his rifle, not aiming at anyone specifically, but making it clear that he could. Release the boys. Now. Jed and the other man holding the children hesitated, looking to Silas for direction. Silas's jaw worked, his fists clenching and unclenching. Finally, with visible reluctance, he jerked his head. Let them go. The men released the boys, who immediately ran toward Timer's horse. He reached down, hauled them up one at a time with effortless strength, settling them in front of him. Then he looked back at Lillian, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the canyon. You have honor, woman. Few of your people do. Then he turned his horse and rode back up the ridge, the 2 boys clinging to him, disappearing into the scrub and red rock as if they had never been there at all. The silence that followed was suffocating. Silas turned to Lillian, and the look in his eyes was pure venom. You just signed your own death warrant, Lillian Pritchard. You just made yourself an enemy of every God-fearing person in this territory. She met his gaze without flinching, even though her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Then I'll face whatever comes, but I won't apologize for saving children. Silas stepped closer, so close she could smell the tobacco on his breath. You'll regret this. Mark my words. By sundown tomorrow, you'll wish you'd let those brats drown. He turned and mounted his horse, the other men following suit. They rode off without another word, leaving Lillian standing alone by the creek, the morning sun now fully risen, casting long shadows across the water. She stood there for a long time, watching the dust settle, knowing that something irreversible had just occurred. She had crossed a line, just as Silas said, and there was no going back. When she finally returned to her house, she found it exactly as she had left it. The buckets still lay by the path where she had dropped them. The garden still struggled in the hard soil. Everything looked normal, unchanged, but she knew better. The world had shifted beneath her feet, and nothing would ever be the same. That night, she did not sleep. She sat by the window, watching the darkness, waiting for something she could not name. When dawn came, it brought with it the sound of horses again. This time there were more of them, at least a dozen riders, maybe more. They surrounded her house, torches in hand, faces grim. Silas was at the front, but beside him now was Caleb Stone, the town council leader, a man whose word carried the weight of law in Whiskey Creek. Caleb dismounted and approached her door. When Lillian opened it, he did not waste time with pleasantries. Lillian Pritchard, you are hereby charged with treason against your own people, with aiding and abetting the enemy, and with endangering the safety of this community. The council has voted. You will face judgment by fire. Her blood ran cold. Judgment by fire? You mean you're going to burn me alive? Caleb's expression was stone. Unless you can prove your loyalty, yes, that is the sentence. They dragged her from her house before she could protest further, before she could run, before she could do anything but struggle uselessly against hands that were far stronger than hers. They tied her wrists with rough hemp rope, loaded her onto a horse, and rode her into the center of town. By the time they reached the square, a crowd had already gathered. Men, women, children, all of them watching with a mixture of fear and fascination. Someone had already erected a stake, tall and thick, driven deep into the ground. At its base, they had piled mesquite wood and dry brush, enough to burn hot and fast. They tied her to the stake, looping the ropes around her waist, her chest, her legs, until she could barely move. Caleb stood before her, holding a torch, his face illuminated by its flickering light. Do you renounce your actions? Do you swear loyalty to your own people and denounce the savages you sought to protect? Lillian looked out at the crowd, at the faces of people she had lived among for years, people she had thought were her neighbors, her community, and she saw nothing but fear and hatred reflected back at her. She took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. I saved 2 children from drowning. If that makes me a traitor, then so be it. I will not apologize for choosing mercy over cruelty. The crowd murmured, angry, restless. Caleb lowered the torch toward the kindling, and that was when the arrow struck the ground at his feet, buried so deep it quivered. The crowd gasped, spun, and there on the ridge overlooking the town was Timer, flanked by a dozen Apache warriors, all of them armed, all of them watching. Timer's voice rang out, clear and commanding. Run now! Lillian did not understand at first. Run! She was tied to a stake, surrounded by an armed mob. How could she run? But then she saw it. The ropes binding her had been cut, not by the settlers, but by an arrow that had sliced through them so precisely she had not even felt it. Another arrow hit the stake above her head, and she realized what was happening. Taimar and his warriors were providing cover, creating chaos, giving her a chance. She did not hesitate. She tore free from the loosened ropes, kicked away the kindling at her feet, and ran. Behind her, the square erupted into chaos. Gunfire cracked through the air, arrows whistled, and the crowd scattered in every direction. She ran toward the edge of town, toward the open desert, her lungs burning, her legs pumping, knowing that if she stopped, if she slowed even for a moment, she would die. And somewhere behind her, she heard the thunder of hooves, and she did not know if they belonged to her enemies or her saviors. The desert swallowed Lillian whole as she ran, her feet pounding against sun-baked earth that cracked beneath her boots like broken pottery. Behind her, the chaos of Whiskey Creek dissolved into distance, but the sound of gunfire still echoed across the canyons, sharp reports that made her flinch with each crack. Her lungs screamed for air, her throat burned with dust and fear, and every muscle in her body begged her to stop, to collapse, to give up. But she did not stop, could not stop, because stopping meant death, and she had not survived the stake only to die running from it. The landscape around her was unforgiving. Red rock formations jutted from the earth like ancient bones, twisted. Juniper trees clung to impossible slopes, and the sun beat down with the weight of divine judgment. There was no shade, no water, no shelter, just endless stretches of desert that seemed to go on forever, indifferent to whether she lived or died. Her dress, already torn from her struggle at the stake, caught on thorny brush and ripped further. Blood seeped from scratches on her arms and legs where mesquite branches had clawed at her. Her hair, once pinned neatly, now hung in wild tangles around her face, matted with sweat and dust. She had no idea where she was going, no plan beyond, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the mob that wanted her dead. The terrain rose and fell in unpredictable waves, forcing her to scramble over rocks and slide down loose scree that threatened to send her tumbling. Once, she lost her footing entirely and fell hard, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. She lay there for a moment gasping, tasting blood and dirt, and thought maybe this was it. Maybe this was where her story ended, alone in the desert, her bones picked clean by vultures. But then she heard it. The sound of a horse approaching, steady and deliberate, not the frantic gallop of pursuers, but something more controlled. She pushed herself up on trembling arms and turned to see Taima riding toward her, his warriors fanned out behind him in a loose formation. He pulled his horse to a stop a few feet away and looked down at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the wind moving through the canyon and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. "You run like a wounded rabbit," Taima said finally, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been amusement or might have been criticism. Loud, clumsy, easy to track. Lillian struggled to her feet, her pride stinging more than her injuries. "I'm not a warrior. I'm a widow who grows vegetables and minds her own business. Or at least I was, until 2 days ago." Taima dismounted, in one fluid motion, and walked toward her, his movements efficient and purposeful. Up close, she could see the details she had missed before, the scars that marked his chest and arms, each one a story of survival. The way his eyes, dark as polished obsidian, seemed to assess everything about her in a single glance, the quiet strength that radiated from him like heat from stone. "Your people wanted to burn you," he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "Yes," Lillian replied, her voice hoarse, "because I saved 2 children." "Your children?" Taima nodded slowly. "Kimi and Takala, my brother's sons. They were told not to go near the creek, but boys do not always listen." He paused, his gaze moving past her toward the direction of Whiskey Creek. "You could have let them drown. Most of your people would have. Some would have held them under to make certain they did not survive." The bluntness of his words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She had seen the hatred in Silas Garrett's eyes, the cold satisfaction in Caleb Stone's voice as he pronounced her sentence. These were people she had lived among, people she had broken bread with after Thomas died, people who had helped her repair her roof after a storm. And they had been willing to burn her alive, without hesitation, without mercy, without even a moment of doubt. "Why did you come back?" she asked suddenly. "You got the boys to safety. You didn't owe me anything." Taima looked at her directly, and there was something in his expression that reminded her of the way Thomas used to look at her when he was trying to decide whether to share a difficult truth. "You showed honor when you did not have to. You risked your life for children who were not your own, who belonged to people your town considers enemies. That is a rare thing, rare enough that I will not let it be answered with fire and death." He turned and gestured to one of his warriors, who rode forward leading a spare horse. "You cannot go back to your town. They will kill you if you do, and you cannot survive out here alone. The desert does not forgive mistakes, and you have already made several." Lillian looked at the horse, then back at Taima, understanding what he was offering, but not quite believing it. "You want me to come with you? To your camp?" Taima's expression did not change. "I want you to live. Whether you come with us or try your luck alone is your choice, but choose quickly. Your people will send riders once they realize you escaped, and they will not stop until they find you." She glanced back toward Whiskey Creek, though it was no longer visible beyond the ridgeline. Everything she owned was back there. Her house, her garden, the few possessions she had managed to keep after Thomas died. But none of that mattered if she was dead. And Taima was right. She would not survive out here alone. She had no water, no food, no knowledge of how to navigate this terrain. She would be dead by nightfall. "All right," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll come with you." Taima nodded once, as if he had expected this answer all along, and gestured toward the horse. Lillian approached it cautiously, placed her hand on its neck. The animal was smaller than the horses she was used to, wiry and tough, built for endurance rather than speed. She managed to pull herself into the saddle, though every muscle protested. Timer mounted his own horse with the ease of someone who had been riding since childhood, and without another word, he turned and led them deeper into the desert. They rode for hours, the sun climbing higher and then beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon. The landscape changed gradually, the flat scrubland giving way to deeper canyons carved by ancient rivers long since dried up. The rock faces here were layered in bands of red, orange and ochre, each stripe a record of time beyond human comprehension. Lillian had never been this far from Whiskey Creek, had never ventured beyond the safe boundaries of what white settlers considered civilization. Now she was riding into territory that maps labeled as hostile, following an Apache warchief and his warriors toward a destination she could not name. No one spoke during the ride. The warriors communicated through gestures and glances, a silent language Lillian could not decipher. She focused on staying in the saddle, on keeping her horse moving in the right direction, on not thinking too hard about what she had left behind or what lay ahead. Thirst began to claw at her throat, and hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she did not complain. She had asked for this, or at least accepted it, and she would endure whatever came next. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, they reached a narrow canyon entrance, hidden between two massive rock formations. Timer dismounted and gestured for the others to do the same. Lillian slid from her horse, her legs nearly buckling beneath her. One of the warriors, a younger man with a long scar running down his left cheek, took the reins from her without a word. Timer led them on foot through the canyon, the passage so narrow in places that they had to walk single file. The walls rose high on either side, blocking out the fading light, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Lillian wrapped her arms around herself. Shivering despite the lingering heat of the day, they emerged into a hidden valley, sheltered on all sides by steep cliffs that would be nearly impossible to scale without ropes. In the center of the valley, illuminated by the last rays of sunlight, was the Apache camp. It was smaller than Lillian had expected, perhaps 30 or 40 dwellings made from brush and animal hides, arranged in a loose circle around a central fire pit. Women moved between the structures, tending to cooking fires and children. Men sat in groups, repairing weapons and tools. Dogs barked and ran between the shelters, and the smell of roasting meat drifted on the evening air. As they entered the camp, activity ceased. Everyone turned to look at them, at Timer and his warriors, and then at Lillian. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackling of fires and the occasional whimper of a dog. Lillian could feel the weight of their stares, could see the questions and suspicion in their eyes. She was an outsider here, a white woman in Apache territory, and her presence was not welcome. An older woman emerged from one of the larger dwellings, her face deeply lined with age, her hair streaked with gray. She wore a dress made from soft deerskin, decorated with intricate beadwork, and when she moved, she did so with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice sharp and demanding, and though Lillian could not understand the words, the tone was clear. She was angry. Timer responded calmly, his voice measured and respectful but firm. The exchange went back and forth several times, the old woman's gestures becoming more emphatic, Timer's responses remaining steady. Finally, the old woman fell silent, her eyes moving to Lillian with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she did not. She held the woman's gaze, refusing to show fear even though her heart was pounding. After what felt like an eternity, the old woman spoke again, this time more quietly. Timer nodded and turned to Lillian. "This is Casa, my mother. She leads the women of our tribe. She says you are not welcome here, that bringing you puts us all in danger." Lillian swallowed hard. "I understand. I didn't ask to come here, but I had nowhere else to go." Timer translated, and Casa responded, her voice still hard but less hostile. "She says you saved Kimmy and Takala. That creates a debt. But debt does not erase danger. Your people will come looking for you, and when they do, they will bring violence." Lillian felt a surge of frustration. "I can't control what my people do. I can only control what I do. And what I did was save 2 children from drowning." If that makes me dangerous, then I don't know what to tell you. Timer translated again, and this time something shifted in Case's expression. Not warmth exactly, but a grudging acknowledgement. She spoke once more, shorter this time, and Timer nodded. She says you may stay, but you will work. You will contribute. And if you bring trouble to this camp, you will be cast out, no matter what debt is owed. Lillian nodded quickly. I'll work. I'll do whatever is needed. I'm not afraid of hard work. Kesa studied her for another long moment, then turned and walked back to her dwelling without another word. The tension in the camp eased slightly, and people began to return to their tasks. Though Lillian could still feel curious eyes on her, Timer gestured for her to follow him, and they walked toward a smaller dwelling at the edge of the camp. You will stay here. It belonged to a family that was killed in a raid last winter. No one has used it since. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He pushed aside the hide flap covering the entrance, revealing a small interior. There was a fire pit in the center, a few woven baskets stacked in one corner, and sleeping furs piled against the back wall. It was sparse but functional. Thank you, Lillian said quietly. Timer nodded. Do not thank me yet. Surviving among my people will be harder than surviving in the desert. They have lost much to yours. Trust is not given freely here. He turned to leave, then paused. There is water in the baskets. Food will be brought to you. Rest tonight. Tomorrow you will meet the others, and they will decide what tasks you are fit for. Then he was gone, leaving Lillian alone in the dim interior of the dwelling. She sank down onto the sleeping furs, her body finally giving in to exhaustion. Every part of her ached, from her blistered feet to her sunburned shoulders. But she was alive. Against all odds, despite everything that had happened, she was still breathing. She thought about Thomas, about the life they had tried to build together in Whiskey Creek. He had been a good man, kind and patient, and his death had shattered her in ways she was still trying to understand. After he died, she had retreated into herself, built walls around her heart, convinced herself that survival meant staying small, staying quiet, staying invisible. But saving those two boys had torn down those walls in an instant, had reminded her that there were things worth risking everything for. And now here she was, in an Apache camp, surrounded by people who had every reason to hate her, relying on the mercy of a warchief who owed her nothing. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the camp settling in for the night. Voices speaking in a language she did not know, the laughter of children, the low murmur of conversations around fires. It was strange and foreign and yet somehow familiar. These were people living their lives, caring for their families, trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. Not so different from her own struggles, really. Just different enemies, different battles. Sleep came slowly, fitfully, interrupted by dreams of fire and smoke and Silas Garrett's cold eyes. But when morning light filtered through the gaps in the hide covering, Lillian woke to find a basket of food waiting just inside the entrance. Dried meat, some kind of flatbread, and a small clay pot of water. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, and tried not to think too hard about what the day ahead would bring. She had survived the stake. She had survived the desert. Now she would have to survive this. And somehow, impossibly, she felt ready. The next 3 weeks blurred together in a rhythm of labor and learning that left Lillian too exhausted to think beyond the immediate task in front of her. She woke each morning before dawn to the sound of camp stirring to life, women stoking fires and preparing the first meal, children emerging from their dwellings, rubbing sleep from their eyes. The work was relentless and varied, designed to test whether she was capable of earning her place among people who had not invited her presence. Gaza assigned her to the most grueling tasks without explanation or sympathy. On the first day, Lillian was sent to gather firewood from the surrounding canyon slopes, a job that required climbing treacherous paths while carrying loads heavy enough to make her shoulders scream in protest. The Apache women watched her struggle with expressions that ranged from mild curiosity to open contempt, and none offered help. She fell twice that first day, scraping her palms raw against the rock. And when she returned to camp with her meager collection of branches, Casa simply pointed to the pile and said something in Apache that made the other women laugh. Taima, who happened to be passing, translated without being asked. She says you gather wood like a child. Slow and careless. Lillian wiped sweat from her forehead and straightened her spine. Then I'll learn to do it better. The second day brought different challenges. She was given a stone grinding tool and a basket of dried corn, told to grind it into meal fine enough for bread. The work was monotonous and painful, the repetitive motion making her wrists ache and her fingers blister. The woman working beside her, whose name Lillian learned was Mala, ground her corn with practiced efficiency, producing twice as much in half the time. Mala was younger than Lillian, perhaps in her mid-20s, with strong arms and a face that rarely smiled. She spoke no English, but her sidelong glances communicated judgment clearly enough. When Lillian's grinding stones slipped and scattered corn across the ground, Mala made a sound of disgust and turned away. By the third day, Lillian's hands were a mess of blisters and cuts. Her back ached from sleeping on unfamiliar ground, and her sunburned skin had begun to peel in painful strips. But she did not complain, did not ask for easier tasks or special consideration. She simply showed up each morning and did whatever was required, no matter how difficult or demeaning. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the hostility around her began to shift. Not to acceptance, not yet, but to something closer to grudging acknowledgement. She was still an outsider, still viewed with suspicion, but she was an outsider who worked without complaint, and that counted for something. On the 8th day, Lillian was scraping animal hides alongside 3 other women when a commotion erupted near the canyon entrance. Riders were approaching, Apache scouts returning from a patrol, and they were riding hard. The entire camp mobilized instantly, men grabbing weapons, women ushering children into shelters, everyone moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had lived under constant threat for generations. Taima emerged from his dwelling already armed, his face set in hard lines. He barked orders in rapid Apache, and warriors scattered to defensive positions around the camp perimeter. Lillian stood frozen, uncertain what to do, until Mala grabbed her arm and pulled her toward one of the larger dwellings. Inside, a dozen women and children huddled together, their faces tense with fear. An older girl, no more than 13, clutched a baby to her chest while tears streamed silently down her face. Lillian recognized the 2 boys she had saved, Kimi and Takala, pressed against their mother's sides. Their eyes found hers across the dim interior, and Takala, the older one, gave her a small nod of recognition. The wait was agonizing. Outside, voices rose and fell, urgent and sharp. Lillian could hear Taima's voice above the others, authoritative and commanding, but she could not make out the words. Time seemed to stretch impossibly, each minute feeling like an hour. The baby in the teenager's arms began to fuss, and the girl rocked it desperately, trying to keep it quiet. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the tension broke. The voices outside changed tone, becoming less urgent, and gradually the camp began to emerge from its defensive posture. When Lillian stepped back outside, she found Taima in conversation with the scouts. Their horses still lathered from hard riding. One of them was gesturing emphatically, painting pictures in the air with his hands, and Taima's expression grew darker with each word. When the scout finished, Taima was silent for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he turned and saw Lillian watching. He walked toward her with deliberate steps, and when he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. Your people have sent a hunting party. 20 men, well armed, led by the one called Garrett. They are searching for you, but they are also burning Apache camps they find along the way. 3 families were killed yesterday, children among them. The words hit Lillian like a physical blow. She felt her knees weaken, felt bile rise in her throat. No, God, no. This is because of me. They're doing this because of me. Taima's expression did not soften. They are doing this because they have always wanted to do this. You are simply the excuse they needed. But his words, meant to be reassuring, only made it worse. 3 families, children, dead because she had saved 2 boys from drowning, because she had refused to let cruelty go unanswered. The weight of it was crushing. "I have to leave," she said suddenly. If I turn myself in, maybe they'll stop. Maybe they'll leave your people alone." Tima's hand shot out and gripped her shoulder, not gently. "You are a fool if you believe that. They will kill you, and then they will continue killing us. Garrett wants blood, and it does not matter whose." He released her and turned away, then paused. "My warriors want to send you away. They say you bring death with you wherever you go. And they are not entirely wrong." The words stung, but Lillian could not argue with them. She had brought this danger to these people, had put them at risk without meaning to, without wanting to. But the damage was done. That night, she lay awake in her dwelling, staring at the hide ceiling and listening to the camp's nighttime sounds. She thought about leaving, about slipping away in the darkness and taking her chances in the desert. But she knew it was pointless. She would be dead within a day, and her death would accomplish nothing. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Casa appeared at her dwelling just after dawn, accompanied by Mala and another woman named Istas. They gestured for Lillian to follow, and she did, curious and wary in equal measure. They led her to a secluded area near the canyon wall, where a natural spring bubbled from the rock, creating a small pool of clear water. Casa spoke, and though Lillian could not understand the words, the meaning became clear when the women began to undress. They were going to bathe, and they expected her to join them. Lillian hesitated, suddenly self-conscious, but Mala made an impatient gesture, and she complied, stripping off her filthy, torn dress and stepping into the water. It was shockingly cold, fed by underground streams that never saw sunlight, and she gasped as it closed around her. The Apache women seemed unbothered by the temperature, submerging themselves completely and emerging with water streaming from their hair. Casa approached Lillian with a handful of soap root and began to scrub her skin, not gently but thoroughly, attacking the layers of dirt and dried sweat with determination. It was an oddly intimate moment, these women who barely tolerated her presence now, tending to her with rough efficiency. Mala worked on her hair, untangling the matted mess with fingers that pulled harder than necessary, but got the job done. Istas scrubbed her back, and when she encountered the burns Lillian had sustained at the stake, still healing but angry and red, she made a soft sound of sympathy. It was the first expression of anything approaching kindness Lillian had received from anyone except Tima. When they finished, Casa produced a clean dress made from soft doe skin, simple and undecorated but well made. She handed it to Lillian with a gesture that brooked no argument. Lillian pulled it on, surprised by how well it fit, how comfortable it was compared to the restrictive corsets and layers she had worn in Whiskey Creek. Casa studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, as if satisfied. She spoke in Apache, and this time Mala translated in halting, heavily accented English. "Casa says you work hard. Not strong yet, but you try. This is good." It was not exactly high praise, but coming from Casa it felt like a victory. Over the following days, Lillian noticed a subtle shift in how the camp treated her. She was still an outsider, still watched carefully, but the open hostility had diminished. Women began to show her how to perform tasks more efficiently, correcting her technique with patience she had not expected. Children, who had previously kept their distance, now approached with curiosity, touching her pale skin and light hair with gentle fingers, giggling at how different she looked. Takala, the boy she had saved, became something of a shadow, following her around camp and trying to teach her Apache words, laughing when she mispronounced them. One afternoon, while Lillian was helping repair a torn hide shelter, Tima approached with a rifle in his hands. He extended it toward her without preamble. "You need to learn to shoot." She looked at the weapon, then at him. "I know how to shoot. My husband taught me." Tima's expression remained neutral. Knowing how to shoot rabbits for dinner is different from knowing how to shoot men who want to kill you. You need to learn the difference. He led her away from camp to a small clearing where several warriors were already practicing. They stopped and watched with undisguised skepticism as Timer set up targets, pieces of wood propped against rocks at varying distances. He handed her the rifle and positioned himself behind her, adjusting her stance with impersonal efficiency. Breathe steady. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull. Anticipate the recoil. Lillian sighted down the barrel at the nearest target, perhaps 30 yards away. She took a breath, held it squeezed. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and the target exploded in a shower of splinters. The warriors murmured, surprised. Timer's expression did not change. Again, farther target. They spent the next hour drilling, Timer pushing her to shoot faster from different positions while moving. By the end, her shoulder was bruised and her ears were ringing, but she had hit more targets than she had missed. The warriors, who had been watching with skepticism, now regarded her with something closer to respect. One of them, a lean man with grey threading his black hair, approached and spoke to Timer in Apache. Timer nodded and turned to Lillian. Chaitan says you shoot better than many of our young warriors. He asks if all white women can shoot like this. Lillian allowed herself a small smile. Tell him only the ones who want to survive. That evening, as the camp gathered around the central fire for the evening meal, Lillian found herself seated among the women rather than isolated at the edge as she had been before. Mullah handed her a bowl of stew without being asked, and Istas made room for her on the log she was sitting on. The conversation flowed around her in Apache, and though she understood none of it, the tone was relaxed, even occasionally punctuated by laughter. She was beginning to understand how the camp functioned, the unspoken hierarchies and relationships that governed daily life. Casa held the most authority among the women, her age and wisdom giving her the final word on domestic matters. Timer commanded the warriors and made decisions about defense and raids, but he consulted with Casa before making major choices that affected the whole camp. The camp operated as a collective, with everyone contributing according to their abilities and everyone sharing in the results. It was different from Whiskey Creek, where wealth and status determined your worth, where men like Caleb Stone made decisions that affected everyone, without consulting those who would be most impacted. As the fire burned low and people began drifting toward their dwellings for the night, Timer appeared at Lillian's side. Walk with me. It was not a question. They walked toward the canyon entrance, away from the camp's lights and sounds, until they stood beneath a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. Timer was quiet for a long time, and Lillian had learned enough about him to know that his silences meant he was thinking, weighing words before speaking them. The hunting party led by Garrett is getting closer, he said finally. My scouts report they are perhaps 2 days' ride from here. They are being less careful now, leaving obvious tracks, burning camps in daylight. They want us to know they are coming. They want us to be afraid. Lillian felt her stomach clench. What will you do? Timer turned to look at her, his face half in shadow. We will fight if we must, but I would prefer to avoid a battle that will cost lives we cannot afford to lose. There are other options, he paused. There is a canyon 3 hours north of here, narrow with only one entrance. If we could lure Garrett's men into it, we could trap them. You want to use me as bait, Lillian said quietly. It was not a question. Timer nodded. They are hunting you. If they believe you are there alone and vulnerable, they will follow. And once they are committed, once they are deep in the canyon, my warriors will close the entrance. No escape. Lillian thought about Silas Garrett, about the cold certainty in his eyes when he had lit the torch that would have burned her alive, about the 3 Apache families his hunting party had already killed, about the children who had died because of a hatred that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with an inability to see other human beings as fully human. All right, she said. I'll do it. Timer studied her face in the starlight. You understand what I am asking? You will be alone in that canyon for a time, with no guarantee we can reach you before they do. If something goes wrong, if they are faster than we anticipate, you could die. Lillian met his gaze steadily. I could die anyway. At least this way my death might mean something. Might save the people who took me in when they had every reason not to. Something shifted in Timer's expression, something that might have been respect or might have been regret. You are not what I expected when I first saw you at the creek. What did you expect? Lillian asked. Timer considered the question. Someone weak, someone who would break under pressure, who would beg for mercy or try to bargain her way to safety. Most of your people are like that when faced with real danger. They are brave only when they have numbers and weapons on their side. He paused. You are different. You have something inside you that does not break. I do not know if that is strength or stubbornness, but it is rare. They stood together in the darkness. Two people from worlds that were supposed to be enemies. Bound together by circumstances neither had chosen, but both had accepted. Tomorrow they would set a trap that might save the camp or might end in disaster. Tonight they simply existed in this moment of quiet before the storm, and Lillian realized with sudden clarity that she had not felt this alive, this present, this certain of her purpose since Thomas had died. Maybe even before that. She had spent so long trying to stay small and safe, and it had brought her nothing but loneliness. Thank you, she said quietly, for not leaving me to burn. Timer was silent for a moment. My people have a saying, the person who saves a life becomes responsible for it. You saved Kimmy and Takala. That made you my responsibility. I do not take such things lightly. He turned to head back toward camp, then paused. Get some rest. We leave at dawn? Lillian watched him walk away, his silhouette merging with the shadows, and then she turned her face toward the stars. Tomorrow, she would walk into a canyon and wait for men who wanted her dead, would bet her life on the hope that Timer and his warriors could close the trap before Garrett closed his hands around her throat. It should have terrified her. But instead she felt calm, centered, ready. She had survived the stake. She had survived 3 weeks in an Apache camp. She would survive this too, or she would die trying, and either way she would face it standing up. Dawn came cold and clear, the kind of morning where the desert air felt sharp enough to cut. Lillian woke before the camp stirred, her body already tense with anticipation of what lay ahead. She dressed in the doe-skin clothing Casa had given her, pulled her hair back, and tied it with a strip of leather Mala had left outside her dwelling. When she emerged, she found Timer waiting with 6 of his best warriors, all of them mounted and ready. They had painted their faces with ochre and ash, traditional war markings that made them look both ancient and terrifying. Timer handed her a canteen of water and a small pouch of dried meat. Eat while we ride. Once we reach the canyon, you will need your strength. She took the provisions and mounted the horse they had prepared for her. The same wiry mare she had ridden from Whiskey Creek. The animal knew her now, responded to her touch without the skittishness of those first days. They rode out as the sun crested the eastern ridge, painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and rust. The journey north took them through terrain that grew progressively more rugged. They followed old game trails that wound between massive boulders and across stretches of hardpan, where nothing grew except the occasional stubborn sage. Timer set a hard pace, pushing them forward with the urgency of a man who knew time was their enemy. The warriors rode in practiced formation, 2 ahead as scouts, 2 flanking, 2 behind, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of Garrett's hunting party. They stopped only once at midday to water the horses at a seep that trickled from a crack in the rock face, while the animals drank. Timer gathered his warriors and spoke to them in low, rapid Apache, gesturing toward the north, and then drawing lines in the dust with a stick. Lillian watched, trying to understand the strategy he was laying out. One of the warriors, the lean man called Chaitan, who had complimented her shooting, asked a question that made Timer pause. His response was longer, more detailed, and when he finished, Chaitan nodded slowly, but his expression remained troubled. When they mounted again, Lillian rode closer to Timer. What did he ask you? Timer kept his eyes forward. He asked if we are making a mistake by trusting our safety to someone who has known us for less than a moon cycle. Someone whose people have been killing ours for generations. Lillian felt her chest tighten. What did you tell him? Timer glanced at her, his expression unreadable. I told him that sometimes the people we should trust least end up being the ones who prove most reliable. And that you have already chosen death over betraying children you did not know. That speaks louder than blood or history. They reached the canyon as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The entrance was exactly as Timer had described, a narrow cleft in the rock face, barely wide enough for two horses to pass side by side. Beyond the entrance, the canyon opened into a longer corridor with high walls that rose 100 feet on either side, sheer and unclimbable. The floor was relatively flat, covered in loose stone and scattered brush, with a few larger boulders that could provide cover. At the far end, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, the canyon narrowed again before opening onto a steep slope that led down to lower country. Timer dismounted and walked the length of the canyon twice, studying the terrain with the eye of someone who had fought in places like this before. He pointed to positions along the rim, where his warriors would hide, showed Lillian where she should position herself to be visible from the entrance, but protected by a large boulder if shooting started. When Garrett arrives, he will be cautious at first. He will send 1 or 2 men in to scout before committing his full force. Let them see you. Call out to them. Make them believe you are alone and desperate. Once they report back and Garrett brings his men inside, that is when we close the trap. Lillian studied the positions, committing them to memory. How long will I have before you can reach me? Timer's jaw tightened. If everything goes as planned, less than a minute. If it does not, longer. You will need to keep moving. Use the rocks for cover. Do not let them corner you. He pulled a knife from his belt, a wicked blade with a bone handle worn smooth by years of use, and pressed it into her hand. If they get close enough that shooting will not help, use this. Go for the throat or the belly. Do not hesitate. The weight of the knife in her palm felt both foreign and necessary. Lillian had never killed a person, had never even seriously contemplated it. But she thought about those 3 Apache families, about the children Garrett's men had murdered, about the flames that had nearly consumed her. If it came to it, if the choice was between her life and theirs, she would use the blade. She would do what needed to be done. The warriors scaled the canyon walls, using ropes they had brought, finding handholds and ledges that looked impossible from below. They moved with the confidence of mountain goats, disappearing into crevices and behind outcroppings, until Lillian could no longer see them, even when she knew exactly where to look. Timer was the last to climb, pausing at the canyon entrance to look back at her one final time. Stay alive, Lily Pritchard. I would consider it a personal failure if you died before I could repay the debt I owe you. Then he was gone, ascending the rock face with quick, efficient movements. The silence that followed was profound. Lillian stood alone in the canyon, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the stone floor, and felt the weight of solitude settle over her like a physical presence. She checked the rifle Timer had left with her, ensured it was loaded and the action worked smoothly. She positioned herself behind the boulder he had indicated, tested her sightlines, made sure she could move quickly to other positions if needed. Then there was nothing to do but wait. The waiting was worse than the running had been, worse than the hard labor in camp, worse than facing Casa's judgment. Waiting gave her time to think, to imagine all the ways this plan could go wrong. What if Garrett was smarter than they anticipated? What if he sent his men around the canyon rim instead of through it? What if they arrived after dark, when Timer's warriors would be harder to coordinate? What if she froze when the moment came? What if fear overwhelmed her training and she got herself killed through hesitation? She forced herself to breathe slowly, to focus on the physical sensations of the moment rather than the spiraling anxiety. The warmth of the rock at her back, the weight of the rifle in her hands, the smell of sage and dust, the distant cry of a hawk circling somewhere above the canyon rim. She thought about Thomas, wondered what he would say if he could see her now. He had always been so careful, so cautious, wanting to avoid conflict and keep their heads down. Would he be proud of her for standing up when it mattered, or would he think she had been foolish to throw her life away for people who were not her own? But they were her own now, were they not? Kimi and Takala, who she had pulled from the creek. Mala, who had shown her how to grind corn properly. Istas, who had made a sympathetic sound when she saw Lillian's burns. Gasa, who had given her clean clothes and a place in the women's circle. Taima, who had ridden back into danger to save her when he could have simply taken his nephews and disappeared. These people had become her tribe in a way Whiskey Creek never had, bound together not by shared history or culture, but by the simple recognition of each other's humanity. The sun touched the western rim of the canyon, and the temperature began to drop noticeably. Lillian wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold, despite the lingering heat in the rocks. She was about to shift position, to move around and keep her muscles from stiffening, when she heard it. The distant sound of horses, many horses. Her heart began to pound, adrenaline flooding her system. She forced herself to remain still, to wait, to not reveal herself too early. The sound grew louder, closer, and then the first rider appeared at the canyon entrance. Even at a distance, Lillian recognized him. Silas Garrett sat tall in the saddle, his rifle resting across his thighs, his eyes scanning the canyon with predatory focus. Behind him, she could make out at least 15 other men, maybe more, all of them armed and looking like they had been riding hard. Garrett raised a hand and the column stopped. He gestured to 2 men, who dismounted and began walking into the canyon on foot, weapons ready. Lillian waited until they were perhaps 50 yards in, close enough to see her clearly, but not so close they could reach her, before she could react. Then she stood up, stepped out from behind the boulder and called out, "I'm here, Garrett." "Just like you wanted." Her voice echoed off the canyon walls, and both scouts froze. One of them raised his rifle, but the other grabbed his arm, stopping him. They backed away slowly, keeping their eyes on her, and returned to where Garrett waited at the entrance. She could not hear what they said, but she could see Garrett's reaction. He leaned forward in his saddle, studying her position, clearly calculating odds and angles. For a long moment, he simply sat there, and Lillian felt a spike of fear. What if he was too smart to take the bait? What if he simply positioned men at the entrance and starved her out? But then he made his decision. He raised his arm and gestured forward, and the entire hunting party began to move into the canyon. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. They came slowly, cautiously, spreading out as much as the narrow space allowed. Garrett rode in the middle of the formation, protected by men on all sides. Lillian backed away, keeping the boulder between herself and the advancing riders, letting them see her retreating deeper into the canyon. She needed them committed, needed them all the way inside before Taima sprang the trap. The horses' hooves clattered on stone, echoing and amplifying until it sounded like an army advancing. When Garrett's group reached the midpoint of the canyon, Lillian heard the sound she had been waiting for, a sharp, ululating cry from above, the Apache war call that had terrified frontier settlers for generations. Rocks and logs that had been positioned on the canyon rim came crashing down behind Garrett's men, blocking the entrance they had just passed through. Arrows whistled through the air, and 2 of Garrett's riders fell from their saddles before they could even raise their weapons. Chaos erupted. Horses screamed and reared, throwing their riders. Men scrambled for cover, trying to return fire at enemies they could barely see. Garrett was shouting orders, trying to impose order on the panic, but his voice was drowned out by gunfire and the continued war cries from above. Lillian raised her own rifle and fired at a man who was drawing a bead on the canyon wall where she knew Chaitan was positioned. Her shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around. More arrows rained down, and more of Garrett's men fell. Those who remained tried to retreat back toward the entrance, only to find it blocked. They were trapped exactly as Taima had planned. Some dismounted and took cover behind boulders, returning fire wildly at the canyon rim. Others tried to climb the walls, scrabbling desperately at handholds that crumbled under their weight. It was a slaughter, and Lillian felt simultaneously horrified and grimly satisfied watching it unfold. Garrett himself had taken cover behind a large rock formation, and from there he was directing what remained of his men with surprising composure. He had perhaps 8 or 9 still fighting, the others dead or wounded too badly to continue. Lillian could see him scanning the canyon, looking for weakness in Timer's position, looking for a way out. His eyes found her, and even at this distance she could see the hatred burning in them. He raised his rifle and fired, the bullet striking the boulder inches from her head, showering her with stone fragments. She ducked back, her heart racing. This was not over yet. Garrett was cornered but still dangerous, and cornered men did desperate things. She risked a glance around the boulder and saw him gesturing to his remaining men, pointing toward the far end of the canyon. He was going to try to break through that way, to punch through whatever defenses Timer had positioned at the exit and escape onto the slope beyond. If he succeeded, if he got even a few men out, they would return with reinforcements, would bring the army if necessary. Lillian made a decision. She left her covered position and ran toward the canyon's far end, using boulders and brush for concealment, staying low and moving fast. Behind her, she could hear Garrett and his men beginning their desperate push. Ahead, she could see the narrowing where the canyon gave way to the slope, and positioned there, partially hidden, was Timer. He had descended from the rim and positioned himself to block this exact escape attempt. She reached him breathless, and he glanced at her with something that might have been approval. "You should have stayed back." Lillian checked her rifle's load. "Should have, did not. Where do you need me?" Timer pointed to a position on the opposite side of the narrow passage. "There, create a crossfire. Do not let them through." She moved to the position, using a fallen log for cover, and raised her rifle. Moments later, Garrett's remaining men came around the bend, moving in a tight group with weapons ready. They stopped when they saw the passage blocked, saw Timer standing there with his rifle raised. For a moment, everything froze. Garrett, in the center of his men, locked eyes with Lillian across the 20 yards that separated them. His face was twisted with rage and something else, the realization that he had lost, that his certainty of victory had led him into a trap from which there was no escape. "Surrender," Timer called out, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "Drop your weapons and you will be allowed to leave. Keep fighting and you will die here." One of Garrett's men, clearly terrified and wanting no part of a last stand, immediately threw down his rifle and raised his hands. Another followed suit, but Garrett himself raised his weapon, pointing it directly at Lillian. "I'll see you burn in hell, you traitorous witch!" He pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, Garrett's aim thrown off by Timer's bullet, which struck him in the chest. Garrett staggered backward, his rifle falling from nerveless fingers, his eyes wide with shock. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt, then back up at Lillian, and his expression held something like disbelief. That this was how it ended, that he had been brought down not by superior numbers or better weapons, but by his own arrogance and the woman he had tried to murder. He collapsed to his knees, then fell forward onto his face. The remaining men threw down their weapons immediately, hands raised in surrender. The battle, such as it was over. Dawn came cold and clear, the kind of morning where the desert air felt sharp enough to cut. Lillian woke before the camp stirred, her body already tense with anticipation of what lay ahead. She dressed in the doe-skin clothing Casa had given her, pulled her hair back, and tied it with a strip of leather Marla had left outside her dwelling. When she emerged, she found Timer waiting with 6 of his best warriors, all of them mounted and ready. They had painted their faces with ochre and ash, traditional war markings that made them look both ancient and terrifying. Timer handed her a canteen of water and a small pouch of dried meat. "Eat while we ride. Once we reach the canyon, you will need your strength." She took the provisions and mounted the horse they had prepared for her, the same wiry mare she had ridden from Whiskey Creek. The animal knew her now, responded to her touch without the skittishness of those first days. They rode out as the sun crested the eastern ridge, painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and rust. The air smelled of sage and distant rain, though no clouds marred the crystalline sky. The journey north took them through terrain that grew progressively more rugged. They followed old game trails that wound between massive boulders and across stretches of hardpan where nothing grew except the occasional stubborn sage. Timer set a hard pace, pushing them forward with the urgency of a man who knew time was their enemy. The warriors rode in practiced formation, 2 ahead as scouts, 2 flanking, 2 behind, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of Garrett's hunting party. Lillian watched how they moved, how they communicated with subtle hand gestures and shifts in position, a language of survival written in movement so small she would have missed them weeks ago. They stopped only once, at midday, to water the horses at a seep that trickled from a crack in the rock face. While the animals drank, Timer gathered his warriors and spoke to them in low, rapid Apache, gesturing toward the north and then drawing lines in the dust with a stick. Lillian watched, trying to understand the strategy he was laying out. The warriors listened intently, occasionally asking questions that Timer answered with precise gestures. One of the warriors, the lean man called Chaitan, who had complimented her shooting, asked a question that made Timer pause. His response was longer, more detailed, and when he finished, Chaitan nodded slowly, but his expression remained troubled. When they mounted again, Lillian rode closer to Timer. "What did he ask you?" Timer kept his eyes forward, watching the trail ahead. "He asked if we are making a mistake by trusting our safety to someone who has known us for less than a moon cycle. Someone whose people have been killing ours for generations." Lillian felt her chest tighten. "What did you tell him?" Timer glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I told him that sometimes the people we should trust least end up being the ones who prove most reliable, and that you have already chosen death over betraying children you did not know. That speaks louder than blood or history." He paused, then added quietly, "But I also told him that if my judgment proves wrong, if you betray us, he has my permission to kill you himself." The bluntness of the statement should have frightened her, but instead Lillian found it strangely reassuring. Timer was not pretending the risk did not exist. He was acknowledging it, accepting it, and trusting her anyway. That trust, conditional and pragmatic as it was, meant more than any flowery declaration. They rode in silence for another hour, the sun climbing higher and the heat building despite the season. Sweat trickled down Lillian's back, and she drank sparingly from the canteen, knowing she might need it later. The landscape around them grew more dramatic. Red rock formations rising like ancient cathedrals, their walls carved by wind and water into fantastic shapes that looked almost deliberate. They reached the canyon as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The entrance was exactly as Timer had described, a narrow cleft in the rock face, barely wide enough for 2 horses to pass side by side. Beyond the entrance, the canyon opened into a longer corridor, with high walls that rose 100 feet on either side, sheer and unclimbable except for those who knew where to look. The floor was relatively flat, covered in loose stone and scattered brush, with a few larger boulders that could provide cover. At the far end, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, the canyon narrowed again before opening onto a steep slope that led down to lower country. Timer dismounted and walked the length of the canyon twice, studying the terrain with the eye of someone who had fought in places like this before. He pointed to positions along the rim where his warriors would hide, showed Lillian where she should position herself to be visible from the entrance but protected by a large boulder if shooting started. When Garrett arrives, he will be cautious at first. He will send 1 or 2 men in to scout before committing his full force. Let them see you. Call out to them. Make them believe you are alone and desperate. Once they report back and Garrett brings his men inside, that is when we close the trap. He crouched and drew in the dust, showing her the positions again, making certain she understood every detail. Lillian studied the positions, committing them to memory. The boulder he indicated was perhaps 30 yards from the entrance, large enough to provide solid cover, but positioned so she would be clearly visible to anyone entering. "How long will I have before you can reach me?" Timer's jaw tightened. "If everything goes as planned, less than a minute once the trap is sprung. If it does not longer, you will need to keep moving. Use the rocks for cover. Do not let them corner you against the walls." He pulled a knife from his belt, a wicked blade with a bone handle, worn smooth by years of use, and pressed it into her hand. "If they get close enough that shooting will not help, use this. Go for the throat or the belly. Do not hesitate. Hesitation is what gets you killed." The weight of the knife in her palm felt both foreign and necessary. Lillian had never killed a person, had never even seriously contemplated it. The idea went against everything she had been taught about civilization and morality, and what separated humans from animals. But she thought about those 3 Apache families, about the children Garrett's men had murdered without remorse, about the flames that had nearly consumed her while good Christian folk watched and nodded approval, about how the veneer of civilization was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. If it came to it, if the choice was between her life and theirs, she would use the blade. She would do what needed to be done and face whatever judgment came after. The warriors scaled the canyon walls, using ropes they had brought, finding handholds and ledges that looked impossible from below. They moved with the confidence of mountain goats, their fingers and toes finding purchase on surfaces that seemed completely smooth. Lillian watched in admiration as they disappeared into crevices and behind outcroppings, until she could no longer see them, even when she knew exactly where to look. Each warrior carried spare ammunition, water, and dried food, prepared to hold their positions for hours, if necessary. Chaitan was the first to reach his position, nearly 70 feet up, and he gave Timer a signal that all was ready. Timer was the last to climb, pausing at the canyon entrance to look back at her one final time. His face was painted with diagonal lines of white and red, traditional markings that made him look like something out of legend. "Stay alive, Lily Pritchard. I would consider it a personal failure if you died before I could repay the debt I owe you." Then he was gone, ascending the rock face with quick, efficient movements that made it look easy, even though Lillian knew it was anything but. The silence that followed was profound. Lillian stood alone in the canyon, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the stone floor, and felt the weight of solitude settle over her like a physical presence. She checked the rifle Timer had left with her, ensured it was loaded, and the action worked smoothly. She worked the lever several times, making certain it would not jam at a critical moment. She positioned herself behind the boulder he had indicated, tested her sightlines to the entrance and to other positions she might need to retreat to. She counted her ammunition, 12 rounds in the rifle and 20 more in the pouch at her belt. Enough for a sustained fight if it came to that, then there was nothing to do but wait. The waiting was worse than the running had been, worse than the hard labor in camp, worse than facing Case's judgment or learning to shoot under the skeptical eyes of Apache warriors. Waiting gave her time to think, to imagine all the ways this plan could go wrong. What if Garrett was smarter than they anticipated? What if he sent his men around the canyon rim instead of through it? What if they arrived after dark, when Timer's warriors would be harder to coordinate? What if she froze when the moment came? What if fear overwhelmed her training and she got herself killed through hesitation? What if her presence here, her very existence, ended up costing Apache lives instead of saving them? She forced herself to breathe slowly, to focus on the physical sensations of the moment, rather than the spiraling anxiety. The warmth of the rock at her back still holding heat from the day's sun. The weight of the rifle in her hands solid and real. The smell of sage and dust and something else, maybe her own fear, manifesting as a metallic taste in the back of her throat. the distant cry of a hawk circling somewhere above the canyon rim, hunting for rabbits or mice in the failing light. She thought about Thomas, wondered what he would say if he could see her now. He had always been so careful, so cautious, wanting to avoid conflict and keep their heads down, believing that if they just worked hard and did not make trouble, they would be left alone. But that philosophy had not saved him from the fever that burned through Whiskey Creek 3 years ago, had not protected him from death any more than keeping quiet would have protected her from the stake. Thomas had been a good man, gentle and kind, but he had also been afraid. Afraid of standing out, afraid of taking sides, afraid of the consequences that came from being noticed. And Lillian had loved him despite that fear, maybe even because of it, because his caution had felt like safety in a world that seemed determined to grind people down. But she understood now that safety was an illusion. There was no such thing as staying out of trouble when trouble was built into the very fabric of how people treated each other. Would Thomas be proud of her for standing up when it mattered? Or would he think she had been foolish to throw her life away for people who were not her own? But they were her own now, were they not? Kimmy and Takala, who she had pulled from the creek, whose small faces still appeared in her dreams. Mala, who had shown her how to grind corn properly, who had stopped looking at her with quite so much contempt. Istas, who had made a sympathetic sound when she saw Lillian's burns, who had shared her food without being asked. Gassa, who had given her clean clothes and a place in the women's circle, who had judged her not by her origins, but by her willingness to work. Taima, who had ridden back into danger to save her when he could have simply taken his nephews and disappeared, who had given her weapons and trust in equal measure. These people had become her tribe in a way Whiskey Creek never had, bound together not by shared history or culture, but by the simple recognition of each other's humanity. By the understanding that survival was not just about staying alive, but about maintaining the parts of yourself that made life worth living, compassion, honor, the willingness to help, even when it cost you something. Whiskey Creek had taught her that civilization could be brutal, that the veneer of respectability could hide rot. The Apache camp had taught her that people dismissed as savages often had more honor than those who claimed moral superiority. The sun touched the western rim of the canyon, and the temperature began to drop noticeably. Lillian wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold, despite the lingering heat in the rocks. The shadows grew longer, deeper, turning the canyon floor into a patchwork of light and dark. She was about to shift position, to move around and keep her muscles from stiffening when she heard it. The distant sound of horses, many horses. Her heart began to pound, adrenaline flooding her system, sharpening her senses until every sound seemed amplified. She forced herself to remain still, to wait, to not reveal herself too early. Patience was survival. Daima had taught her that. The sound grew louder, closer, the echo making it difficult to judge exact distance. Then the first rider appeared at the canyon entrance, silhouetted against the fading light. Even at a distance, Lillian recognized him. Silas Garrett sat tall in the saddle, his rifle resting across his thighs, his eyes scanning the canyon with predatory focus. He had the look of a man who had been riding hard for days, dust-covered and grim, but there was satisfaction in his posture. He thought he had won, thought he had finally cornered his prey. Behind him, she could make out at least 15 other men, maybe more, all of them armed and looking like they had been riding through hell to get here. Garrett raised a hand, and the column stopped. He sat there for a long moment, studying the canyon with the caution of experience. He had fought Apaches before, knew their tactics, knew they favored ambushes and traps. But he also knew that Lillian was supposedly alone, desperate, at the end of her rope. He gestured to 2 men, who dismounted and began walking into the canyon on foot, weapons ready, eyes scanning the rim and the shadows. They moved carefully, professionally, men who had done this kind of work before. Lillian waited until they were perhaps 50 yards in, close enough to see her clearly, but not so close they could reach her before she could react. Then she stood up, stepped out from behind the boulder, and called out, "I'm here, Garrett. Just like you wanted. Just me and nowhere left to run." Her voice echoed off the canyon walls, sounding stronger than she felt, and both scouts froze. One of them raised his rifle instinctively, but the other grabbed his arm, stopping him. They stared at her for a long moment, taking in her Apache clothing, her disheveled appearance, the rifle in her hands. Then they backed away slowly, keeping their eyes on her, and returned to where Garrett waited at the entrance. She could not hear what they said, but she could see Garrett's reaction. He leaned forward in his saddle, studying her position, his eyes moving from her to the canyon walls, to the narrow exit at the far end. He was clearly calculating odds and angles, weighing the possibility of ambush against the prize of finally capturing the woman who had humiliated him. For a long moment, he simply sat there, and Lillian felt a spike of fear. What if he was too smart to take the bait? What if he simply positioned men at the entrance and starved her out? What if 3 weeks of planning and preparation came to nothing because he saw through the trap? But then greed and hatred won out over caution, as they so often did. He made his decision. He raised his arm and gestured forward, and the entire hunting party began to move into the canyon. They came slowly, cautiously, spreading out as much as the narrow space allowed. Garrett rode in the middle of the formation, protected by men on all sides, his rifle now across his saddle ready to fire. Lillian backed away, keeping the boulder between herself and the advancing riders, letting them see her retreating deeper into the canyon. She needed them committed, needed them all the way inside before Timer sprang the trap. The horses' hooves clattered on stone, echoing and amplifying until it sounded like an army advancing, until the sound filled the canyon like thunder. When Garrett's group reached the midpoint of the canyon, when the last of his riders had passed through the entrance and there was no easy retreat, Lillian heard the sound she had been waiting for, a sharp, ululating cry from above, the Apache war call that had terrified frontier settlers for generations, that spoke of death coming from unexpected angles. Rocks and logs that had been positioned on the canyon rim, held in place by ropes that warriors now cut, came crashing down behind Garrett's men, blocking the entrance they had just passed through. The sound was deafening, boulders the size of wagons smashing into the canyon floor. Throwing up clouds of dust and stone fragments, arrows whistled through the air, and 2 of Garrett's riders fell from their saddles before they could even raise their weapons, feathered shafts appearing in their chests as if by magic. Chaos erupted instantly. Horses screamed and reared, throwing their riders or bolting in panic. Men scrambled for cover, trying to return fire at enemies they could barely see, shadows moving on the canyon rim, 60 feet above them. Garrett was shouting orders, trying to impose order on the panic, but his voice was drowned out by gunfire and the continued war cries from above, by the screams of wounded men and terrified animals. Lillian raised her own rifle and fired at a man who was drawing a bead on the canyon wall where she knew Chetan was positioned. Her shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around, and he dropped his weapon with a cry of pain. She worked the lever, ejected the spent cartridge, and fired again at another target. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, familiar now after hours of practice, and she fell into the rhythm Taima had drilled into her. Breathe, aim, squeeze, work the action, find the next target. Do not think, just act. Hesitation kills. More arrows rained down with brutal efficiency, and more of Garrett's men fell. Those who remained tried to retreat back toward the entrance, only to find it blocked by tons of rock. They were trapped, exactly as Timer had planned, caught in a killing box with no escape. Some dismounted and took cover behind boulders, returning fire wildly at the canyon rim, their shots ricocheting off stone or disappearing into empty air. Others tried to climb the walls in desperation, scrabbling at handholds that crumbled under their weight, making themselves easy targets. It was a slaughter methodical and merciless, and Lillian felt simultaneously horrified by the violence and grimly satisfied watching men who had burned Apache camps now experiencing the terror they had inflicted on others. Garrett himself had taken cover behind a large rock formation near the center of the canyon. and from there he was directing what remained of his men with surprising composure. He had perhaps 8 or 9 still fighting, the others dead or wounded too badly to continue. Lillian could see him scanning the canyon, looking for weakness in Timer's position, looking for any way out of the trap. His eyes found her across the chaos, and even at this distance through the gun smoke and dust, she could see the hatred burning in them. Pure distilled loathing. He raised his rifle with deliberate care and fired, the bullet striking the boulder inches from her head, showering her with stone fragments that cut her cheek. She ducked back, her heart racing, blood trickling warm down her face. This was not over yet. Garrett was cornered but still dangerous, and cornered men did desperate things. She risked a glance around the boulder and saw him gesturing to his remaining men, pointing toward the far end of the canyon. He was going to try to break through that way, to punch through whatever defenses Timer had positioned at the exit and escape onto the slope beyond. If he succeeded, if he got even a few men out, they would return with reinforcements. They would bring the army, would turn this from a successful ambush into the opening salvo of a war that would see every Apache in the territory hunted down. Lillian made a decision. She left her covered position and ran toward the canyon's far end, using boulders and brush for concealment, staying low and moving fast. Behind her, she could hear Garrett and his men beginning their desperate push, their boots pounding on stone, their voices raised in determination or desperation or both. Ahead, she could see the narrowing where the canyon gave way to the slope, and positioned there, partially hidden behind an outcropping, was Timer. He had descended from the rim while the battle raged and positioned himself to block this exact escape attempt. His face was grim, his rifle steady. She reached him breathless, and he glanced at her with something that might have been approval or might have been resignation. "You should have stayed back where it was safer." Lillian checked her rifle's load, saw she had 4 rounds left in the magazine. "Should have, did not. Where do you need me?" Timer pointed to a position on the opposite side of the narrow passage. "There, create a crossfire. Do not let them through. If they escape, everything we have done here means nothing." She moved to the position, using a fallen log for cover, and raised her rifle. Her hands were steady now, the initial terror burned away by action and purpose. Moments later, Garrett's remaining men came around the bend, moving in a tight group with weapons ready, desperation making them reckless. They stopped when they saw the passage blocked, saw Timer standing there with his rifle raised, saw Lillian positioned on the opposite side with her own weapon trained on them. For a moment, everything froze in a strange tableau. Garrett, in the center of his men, locked eyes with Lillian across the 20 yards that separated them. His face was twisted with rage and something else, something that looked almost like respect, or maybe just recognition. The realization that he had lost, that his certainty of victory had led him into a trap from which there was no escape, that the woman he had tried to burn alive had become the instrument of his downfall. "Surrender," Timer called out, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the canyon. "Drop your weapons and you will be allowed to leave on foot. Keep fighting and you will die here. This is your only chance." One of Garrett's men, clearly terrified and wanting no part of a last stand, immediately threw down his rifle and raised his hands, backing away from the group. Another followed suit, then another. But Garrett himself stood firm, and 4 men remained loyal to him or too afraid to surrender. Garrett raised his weapon, pointing it directly at Lillian, and his face held absolute conviction. "I'll see you burn in hell, you traitorous witch. You chose them over your own kind, and that's a sin that can't be forgiven." His finger tightened on the trigger, and Lillian knew with sudden clarity that he was going to shoot, was going to kill her, even if it meant his own death immediately after. She started to duck, started to move, but she knew she was too slow. The shot rang out, but it was not Garrett who fired. Timer's bullet struck him in the chest, the impact throwing him backward. Garrett staggered, his rifle falling from nerveless fingers, clattering on stone. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt with an expression of profound surprise, as if he had never truly believed he could be killed. Then he looked back up at Lillian, and his mouth moved, trying to form words that would not come. He collapsed to his knees, swayed there for a moment like a tree about to fall, then pitched forward onto his face and lay still. The remaining men threw down their weapons immediately, hands raised in surrender, all fight gone from them, with their leader dead. The battle, such as it was over. The canyon fell silent, except for the moans of wounded men and the nervous stamping of horses. Timer's warriors descended from their positions on the rim, materializing from shadows and crevices, their faces still painted for war. They moved among the survivors, binding their hands, checking the dead to make certain they posed no further threat. The aftermath of the battle brought a silence more profound than any Lillian had experienced, broken only by the labored breathing of wounded men and the soft murmur of Timer's warriors as they moved through the canyon. Torches were lit, casting flickering shadows across stone walls stained with blood. Lillian stood near the fallen log, where she had taken her final position, her rifle still in her hands, watching as the Apache warriors systematically collected weapons and supplies from the dead and captured. She felt numb, disconnected, as if watching events unfold from a great distance. Her hands trembled slightly, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the fight now draining away and leaving exhaustion in its wake. Timer approached her, his war paint streaked with sweat and dust, his expression unreadable in the torchlight. "You fought well. Better than I expected." It was not effusive praise, but coming from him it felt like the highest compliment. He reached out and gently turned her face to examine the cut on her cheek where stone fragments had struck her. His touch was surprisingly gentle for someone whose hands had just dealt death. "This will scar, but not badly. Istas has medicine that will help it heal clean." Lillian touched her face, felt the dried blood crusted there, and was surprised to realize she had forgotten about the wound entirely. Pain seemed distant, unimportant compared to the magnitude of what had just occurred. "What happens now?" she asked, gesturing toward the captured men who sat with their hands bound, surrounded by Apache warriors with drawn weapons. Their faces held varying expressions of fear, resignation, and defiance. Some stared at the ground, others glared at their captors with hatred that would never fade. Timer followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. "We take what we can use. Horses, weapons, supplies. The wounded who can walk will be given water and sent back toward Whiskey Creek on foot. It will take them 3 days to reach it, maybe 4 if they are slow. By then, we will be gone, and they will have a story to tell that might make others think twice before hunting us." He paused, looking back at the bodies scattered across the canyon floor. "The dead we leave for the buzzards. They came here seeking to kill, and they found what they were looking for. That is the only justice the desert provides." Over the next hour, the canyon became a scene of organized activity. The Apache warriors moved with practiced efficiency, stripping the dead of anything useful and loading supplies onto captured horses. Rifles, ammunition, blankets, food supplies, canteens, anything that could help the band survive was gathered and secured. The wounded prisoners were given minimal medical attention, enough to keep them alive for the journey back, but nothing more. One man, gut-shot and clearly dying, begged for water in a voice that grew progressively weaker until it stopped entirely. Lillian watched him die and felt nothing, which frightened her more than the violence itself. When had she become someone who could watch death without flinching? Chaitan approached carrying Garrett's rifle, an expensive weapon with silver inlay work on the stock, the kind of gun that cost more than most families earned in a year. He offered it to Timer, who examined it briefly, running his fingers over the engraved metal, then handed it to Lillian. "Garrett will have no use for it now. You earned this." Lillian took the rifle, feeling its weight, its balance. It was a beautiful weapon, crafted with care and precision by someone who took pride in their work, and she hated everything it represented. Garrett had probably bought it with money earned from businesses that exploited others, had carried it while hunting human beings. But Timer was right. She had earned it. She had stood her ground when running would have been easier, had pulled the trigger when hesitation might have cost Apache lives. This rifle was proof that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They left the canyon as full darkness fell, a long column of horses and warriors moving north by starlight. The prisoners walked in the center of the column, stumbling over unseen obstacles, too exhausted and defeated to cause trouble. Several times men fell and had to be hauled back to their feet by warriors who showed neither sympathy nor cruelty, just efficient indifference. Lillian rode near the front beside Timer, her body aching with fatigue, but her mind too active to rest. She kept replaying the battle in her mind, seeing Garrett's face as he fell, hearing the screams of wounded men, smelling the gun smoke and blood that still clung to her clothes. She wondered if these images would ever fade, or if they would haunt her for whatever remained of her life. They reached the Apache camp just before dawn, and the reception was not what Lillian expected. She had thought there might be celebration, victory cries, the kind of triumphant return she had read about in frontier novels. Instead, there was quiet acknowledgement, subdued conversations in Apache, women emerging from dwellings to check that their men had returned safely. The atmosphere was one of relief rather than joy, of gratitude that the threat had been neutralized without losing anyone from the band. War, Lillian was learning, was not glorious. It was necessary and brutal, and something to be endured rather than celebrated. Casa appeared, walking directly to Timer with the purposeful stride of someone who had been waiting anxiously, despite her calm exterior. They spoke in low tones while she examined him for injuries, her hands moving over his arms and torso with the practiced touch of someone who had done this many times before. When she was satisfied he was unharmed, she turned to Lillian and studied her with those penetrating dark eyes that seemed to see past all pretense. Casa reached out and touched the cut on Lillian's cheek, then nodded once as if confirming something she had already suspected. She spoke in Apache, her voice carrying authority that made everyone nearby stop and listen. Mala appeared beside Casa and translated, her English still halting but clearer than it had been weeks ago. Casa says you have proven yourself beyond doubt. You are no longer guest in our camp. You are one of us now, sister to our women, defender of our children. This is rare honor for outsider. Lillian felt something break loose inside her chest, some tight knot of tension she had been carrying since the moment she pulled those boys from the creek. Tears welled in her eyes, and she did not try to stop them. Tell her I am honored beyond words. Tell her I will continue to earn that trust every day I draw breath. The next weeks brought changes both subtle and profound. Lillian's role in the camp shifted from probationary laborer to accepted member. She was given more complex tasks, included in conversations that had previously stopped when she approached, taught skills that were traditionally passed only to those considered true members of the tribe. Istas showed her how to prepare hides properly, the painstaking process of scraping and stretching, and treating them with brain matter until they were supple as cloth. Mala taught her to identify edible plants in the desert, which roots could be ground into flour, which leaves made medicine for fever or infection. Even Casa, formidable and sparing with affection, began to treat her with something approaching warmth, occasionally touching her shoulder in passing or nodding approval at work well done. But the most significant change was in how Timer interacted with her. He had always been respectful, had acknowledged her courage and kept his promises, but there had been distance between them. That distance began to close. He sought her out in the evenings after the day's work was done, sitting beside her at the central fire and speaking about things beyond immediate survival. He told her about his childhood, about learning to hunt with his father before soldiers killed him during a raid on their winter camp, about his sister who had died from white man's disease, smallpox that swept through their people like wildfire, about the weight of leadership, of making decisions that meant life or death for people he loved. Lillian shared her own stories in return. about growing up in St. Louis, about how her father had died, building railroads, and her mother had taken in laundry to keep them fed. About meeting Thomas at a church social, about how he had seemed so solid and reliable. About building a life in Whiskey Creek that had always felt slightly unreal, like she was playing a role rather than living authentically. About the loneliness that had settled over her after Thomas died. An isolation that had nothing to do with being alone and everything to do with being surrounded by people who saw her as a curiosity or a burden rather than a person. One evening, perhaps 6 weeks after the canyon battle, Timer asked her a question that had clearly been building for some time. "Do you regret it? Saving Kimi and Takala? Everything that came after?" Lillian considered the question seriously, weighing the truth of her feelings. "I regret that people died. I regret that my choice to help led to violence. But do I regret pulling 2 children from the water? No, never. I would do it again, knowing everything that would follow, because some things are worth the cost, even when the cost is high." Timer was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he spoke again, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "My people have a belief that some souls are meant to find each other across great distances, across barriers that should keep them apart. That these meetings are not accidents, but something the spirits arrange." He turned to look at her. "I think perhaps your spirit and mine were meant to meet. I think perhaps you were always meant to be here." Lillian's breath caught. She had felt the connection between them growing, had noticed how her heart beat faster when he was near. "I think you might be right. I think maybe I spent my whole life looking for a place I belonged, and I just did not know it until I found it." What followed was not a courtship in any traditional sense. There were no formal declarations, no gifts exchanged. Instead, there was a quiet understanding, a gradual intertwining of their lives that felt as natural as breathing. Timer moved his belongings into her dwelling, and no one in the camp seemed surprised. Casa gave them a new sleeping robe, beautifully worked with beaded designs that told the story of 2 paths converging. Mala teased Lillian good-naturedly about finally finding a man strong enough to match her stubbornness. The children accepted the change without question, and Kimi and Takala began calling her aunt in Apache. As summer deepened into fall, the camp prepared to move to their winter grounds in the mountains. A sheltered valley where they could wait out the cold months. Lillian helped with the preparations, learning how to efficiently pack an entire life onto horses. The day they departed, she looked back one final time at the canyon where she had spent these transformative months. She would never see it again, but it would live in her forever as the place where she had become someone new. The winter camp was nestled in a high valley, surrounded by pine forests, protected from the worst winds by cliff walls. Snow fell in great silent curtains, blanketing everything in white. Inside the dwellings, fires burned warm and food remained adequate if not abundant. Lillian learned to make snowshoes, to track elk through deep powder, to recognize the signs of changing weather. She became stronger, more capable, more confident in her ability to survive whatever the world threw at her. It was during that winter that she realized she was pregnant. The signs were subtle at first: missed monthly courses, persistent nausea. But when her belly began to swell, there was no denying it. She told Timer one evening as they lay together, his hand resting on her stomach. He was silent for so long she began to worry, but when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Our child. This is a great gift." Casa, when she learned of the pregnancy, became fiercely protective. She prepared special teas to ease the nausea, monitored Lillian's health with intense attention. Istas and Mala treated her with renewed gentleness, helping with work when pregnancy made her tired. Spring came slowly to the high country. By the time the camp prepared to move back to lower elevations, Lillian was visibly pregnant. The journey was harder, her changing body making her less agile, but she refused special treatment. They returned to the summer camp in late spring, and Lillian felt a sense of homecoming. This place now felt more like home than anywhere she had lived. Her labor began on a morning in early summer. The pain started slow and far apart. Casa took charge immediately, clearing Lillian's dwelling and calling for Istas and Mala to assist. Taima was banished outside with the other men, though she could see his worry as he paced. The labor lasted through the morning and into the afternoon, waves of pain that built and crested. Casa gave calm instructions. Push when the pain comes. Rest between, breathe. And somehow, as the sun began its descent toward evening, the baby came. A girl, tiny and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that worked perfectly. Casa cleaned the baby and wrapped her in soft doeskin, then placed her in Lillian's arms. The feeling was indescribable. This tiny person, this perfect combination of her and Taima. Lillian looked down at her daughter's face and felt tears streaming down her cheeks. Taima was allowed in then, and when he saw his daughter for the first time, his fierce warrior's face crumpled with emotion. He reached out with one finger and touched the baby's tiny hand, and she grasped it with surprising strength. "What will we name her?" Lillian asked. Taima thought for a moment. "Nasha, it means owl, because the owl sees in darkness, finds its way when others are lost. Like her mother did, like I hope she always will." Lillian repeated the name, feeling its rightness. Nasha, yes, that is who she is. The months that followed were the happiest of Lillian's life. She had purpose, had people who valued her, had a partner who saw her as an equal, had a daughter whose presence filled every day with wonder. She taught Nasha English along with Apache as she grew. She watched her daughter learn to smile, to laugh, to reach for things. She saw Taima transform from stern warchief to devoted father, his hard demeanor melting whenever he held his daughter. Years passed in this way, seasons turning one into another. Nasha grew into a strong, capable child who could track game by the time she was 5, who spoke 2 languages fluently, who knew the names of every plant and animal in their territory. She had her father's fierce spirit and her mother's stubborn determination. Lillian's hair began to show grey. Her hands grew rougher. Her face bore the marks of sun and wind. She bore no resemblance to the frightened woman who had once grown vegetables in Whiskey Creek. That person felt like someone from a story rather than someone she had actually been. On a summer evening when Nasha was 7 years old, Lillian sat with Taima on a ridge overlooking their camp, watching the sun set. "Do you ever regret it?" Taima asked. "Giving up your world for this one?" Lillian thought about everything she had lost and everything she had gained. About the life she might have lived if she had walked past that creek, if she had let 2 boys drown because helping them was dangerous. About growing old alone in Whiskey Creek, tolerated but never truly accepted. About never knowing this fierce love, never holding Nasha, never becoming someone strong enough to build a life from nothing but will and choice. "Not once," she said firmly. "Not even for a moment. I found my people, my purpose, my home. I found you and Nasha, and a life that means something beyond just existing. That is worth more than all the civilization in the world." Below them, Nasha's laughter rang out as she played with other children, the sound rising toward the darkening sky like a prayer or a promise. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own dangers, its own need for courage. But tonight, there was peace, there was family, there was the simple, radical act of living free on their own terms. And that, Lillian had learned through fire and blood and love, was everything that mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.